Now feel the irony, because at the same time he's selling short term, Congress is being dragged, vote by vote, into whether they can stop him at all. The Pentagon is briefing lawmakers on a first week cost already in the tens of billions, and global energy markets are moving like this conflict is not ending soon. Here is what he did not calculate. The story is no longer whether Trump wants the war to be short. The story is whether the system around him can force it to stop, or whether it will escalate faster than anyone can vote. Today, I want to break this down properly. This matters today because wars do not end when presidents announce timelines. They end when costs, capabilities, and coalitions break. Gone. The illusion that this is contained. Zero. Zero control over what happens when the Strait of Hormuz becomes a threat environment instead of a trade lane. Reuters. And then nothing. Nothing in Congress's early votes actually stopped the operation. The House rejected the war powers push 219 to 212. That is not symbolism. That is permission, at least for now. And when gas jumps by nearly 27 cents in a week to $3.25 nationally, that is not a number on a chart. That is your commute. That is your delivery fees. That is the cost of everything that arrives on a truck. Not politics, consequences, not metaphorically, operationally. Let me be precise about what we know and what we do not know, because precision matters more than narrative in a situation this consequential. What we know is that Trump publicly framed the Iran war as a short-term excursion, using that exact phrase at his Florida resort while arguing the United States is getting very close to finishing. What we know is that the House vote that could have constrained him did not pass. Reuters reports the House rejected the war powers effort 219 to 212, largely on party lines, leaving the operation intact. What we know is that the Pentagon is already putting an enormous price tag on this in closed-door briefings, with NBC reporting officials estimated more than $11.3 billion for the first 6 days alone. What we do not know is the real exit strategy, not the slogan, not finish the job. The actual sequence of conditions that would allow the White House to stop without triggering a wider regional retaliation cycle. What we do not know is whether the next escalation step will be strategic or political, because when presidents get boxed in at home, they sometimes try to punch their way out overseas. Here is the promise, word for word, short-term excursion. Here is what he did after that promise. The United States did not announce limited support. It announced major combat operations in Iran. That phrase matters. Major combat operations is not a raid. It is a campaign classification, and the president used it deliberately. In that same statement, Trump said the U.S. objective is to eliminate imminent threats, destroy Iran's missiles, raise their missile industry, and annihilate their navy. Those are not the verbs of a quick punitive strike. Those are the verbs of dismantlement. Now plug that into the domestic timeline. Under the War Powers Resolution Framework, the president must submit a report to Congress within 48 hours in certain circumstances, and that reporting triggers a 60-day window after which unauthorized hostilities are supposed to terminate unless Congress authorizes or extends them. 48 hours is real, but it is not what viral headlines imply. It is a reporting trigger that starts larger clocks. Before we go any further, stop at this subject because the War Powers Resolution is not a magic off switch. It is a procedural weapon. It forces timelines. It forces votes, but it does not physically recall aircraft from the sky. And we saw the proof. A War Powers Resolution aimed at requiring authorization did not pass the House. It failed 219-212. That is the congressional reality right now. Now link that to the strategic environment. Oil didn't just rise. It whipped upward with extreme volatility. Reuters reported intraday peaks where Brent hit 119.50 and WTI hit 119.48 before settling lower. Prices moving like markets expect disruption, not quick normalization. And insurance didn't just get more expensive. Reuters reported maritime war risk premiums surging in some cases by more than 1,000%, with market estimates implying multi-million-dollar premiums per voyage for tankers and roughly 1,000 vessels with aggregate hull value above $25 billion sitting exposed in the Gulf region. That is not short-term. That is systemic stress. Now understand what this actually means. Politically, Trump is trying to narrate control. He is selling short term because the public's tolerance collapses once costs become visible. And the polling shows the problem. CNN's SSRS poll found 59% disapprove of the initial decision to strike Iran. 60% say they don't think Trump has a clear plan, and 62% say he should get congressional approval for further action. That is not background noise. That is political structural weakness in week 2. Militarily, the phrase major combat operations commits you to momentum, because once you tell the world you are going to raise missile industries and annihilate navies, you have declared a theory of victory that requires sustained strikes and sustained intelligence. But here is what he did not calculate. He doesn't control the cost curve. Pentagon officials estimated to senators the first 6 days cost more than $11.3 billion. That is an early burn rate in a campaign that also requires stockpile replenishment and regional posture maintenance. You can announce short term. You cannot announce cheap. Now use the phase structure, because this is how campaigns actually operate. Phase 1 was shock and awe declaration, the major combat operations announcement that signals commitment. Phase 2 was congressional containment attempts, votes meant to reassert legislative authority. Phase 3 was supposed to be political closure, short-term excursion, quick wrap, victory messaging. Phase 3 is not happening, and that is not the language of a president in control. That is the language of a president running out of clocks. Think about the 48 hours obsession in headlines. Under the War Powers framework, 48 hours is a reporting requirement in defined circumstances. It is not a clean 48-hour evacuation order. The real binding pressure is the 60-day termination window described in the War Powers framework and the resource and political constraints that hit long before day 60. That is where we were. Here is where we are now. The war is continuing, Congress is split, and the system is drifting toward the worst-case outcome in Washington, an open-ended campaign without a voted authorization, funded by emergency supplements, while energy prices punish voters at home. And now look at the fracture. The first fracture is Congress itself. The House did not end the operation. It rejected the War Powers constraint 219 to 212, and Reuters makes the critical point. Even if it had passed, the Senate and an expected veto would have been major obstacles. In other words, the anti-war camp does not have a clean lever. They have friction, not control. The second fracture is inside the Republican coalition. CNN's poll shows a brutal internal split. The president's base has higher confidence, but the broader public expects a long conflict, doubts a plan, and wants Congress involved. Trump is trapped between loyalty politics and math. Polling becomes a form of gravity. Now look at the fracture in the narrative itself. Trump said short-term excursion. His own defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, is quoted in NBC's report as having described the attacks as only just the beginning, and Trump tried to square that circle by saying, "I think you could say both. You cannot. Not in strategy, not in war. Either you are winding down or you are expanding objectives." And there is a trapped nation dynamic here too, even if it is not a foreign capital. Trump himself is trapped between a war he marketed as brief and a campaign design that burns money, munitions, and attention faster than political narratives can replenish them. Exit strategy, not victory. That is Washington's priority. Survival, not triumph. That is what this war becomes when the home front starts cracking. Now look at the cost, because this is where the war becomes personal. A reported the national average for a gallon of regular gas jumped nearly 27 cents in a week to $3.25 on March 5th, explicitly tying the move to crude oil rising due to Middle East conflict dynamics. That is not a number on a chart. That is your weekly budget being rewritten in real time. And this did not begin at $3.25. LAA reported on February 26th that the national average rose to $2.98, the seasonal climb beginning before the later conflict shock fully expressed itself at the pump. The trend was already upward. War accelerates trends. Now connect that to global stabilization attempts. Reuters reported the International Energy Agency agreed to release a record 400 million barrels of oil from strategic stockpiles, backed by all 32 member countries, with the U.S. contributing 172 million barrels. An emergency action designed to fight the exact inflationary pressure you feel at the pump. Let that sink in. 32 countries do not coordinate the largest strategic release in modern history because a short term excursion is ending. They do it because they think supply disruption could outlast politics. But here's the part that makes you smarter than anyone reading the headlines. The 48 hours hook is being used as a weapon of confusion. Here is what is not being covered. The war power system is not one clock, it is multiple clocks. Yes, there is a 48-hour reporting requirement for deployments into hostilities in defined circumstances, documented clearly in congressional research. But the strategic trap is the 60-day termination window and the funding mechanics that follow, not an overnight 2-day countdown to peace. Now add the second layer. Even without a successful war powers constraint vote, Congress retains the most brutal lever in American war making: money. Politico reports lawmakers expect the Iran supplemental request could reach at least $50 billion based on conversations with administration officials, while also noting outside estimates that put early operational costs already in the $11.2 to $14.5 billion range, depending on methodology. This is where the war becomes a domestic siege: stockpile restoration, magazine refilling, and readiness costs that persist long after the last strike. That is not a trade deal. That is a verdict. If Trump cannot end the war quickly, he has to fund it. If he has to fund it, he has to negotiate with Congress. If he has to negotiate with Congress, the short-term excursion becomes a long-term political hostage situation. That is your dinner table sentence. He called it a short-term excursion, but the costs, the legal clocks, and the oil shock are already turning it into a long war trap. He promised short-term. He delivered a strategic commitment with open-ended verbs: major combat operations, raise, annihilate. The gap between those two realities is the story of this war. And there is no off-ramp visible right now, not because no one is looking for one, but because the conditions that would make an off-ramp possible — clear objectives, credible timelines, stable shipping lanes, and a domestic coalition willing to pay — have been systematically destroyed by the collision between rhetoric and reality. That is where we are today. I will be back the moment something breaks. Share this if it gave you value. This story deserves far more attention than it is getting. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. You saw it first. See you in the next one.